It all started out with the disappearance of 12-year-old Manuel Shadwald. Manuel was born on January 24, 1981 in Berlin, Germany, to a loving family. He enjoyed playing computer games and sports and frequented local department stores in Berlin or at the Fez, the Wohlheide Leisure and Recreation Center, where he played computer games. On July 24, 1993, Manuel left his parents' apartment in Berlin Tempelhof to go to the Fez by public transport, but he never arrived.
On July 24th, 1993, on Saturday, he set off for the Fezi Leisure Center 10 kilometers away in the Köpenick district. The boy probably took public transportation, but we don't know for sure because he never arrived at the Fez. The boy with the slightly longer dark hair was never seen again. Especially at the beginning, the police intensively searched for him because he liked to play in department stores and at the FEZ on computers. They questioned salespeople and supervisors. A description of the boy who was last wearing jeans, t-shirt, and a turquoise backpack with the label Miami Vice was published. Newspapers and television showed a photo. The police combed through the wooded area at the leisure center Fezet, unsuccessfully. Tips that the police received did not lead to suspect, and that the boy just got lost or had an accident and has not been found to this day. Nobody actually believes that. The police initially only conducted one missing person case. Today they refer to the Berlin Public Prosecutor's Office. A spokesperson there said that an investigation is being conducted on the suspicion of homicide, but the proceedings have been ongoing for a long time. There are no new findings.
It was discovered that Manuel had most likely been abducted and taken to the Netherlands. The Guardian reported in 2000 that, quote, by 1998, however, Dutch journalists had dug out a history of sightings, which suggested he had been put to work in Rotterdam. But what happened to Manuel and the worldwide network that this whole thing exposed is so much more disturbing than you could ever possibly imagine. Today, we're going to dive deep into this story and teach you about some of the evils that exist in our very world right beneath our noses. I'm Colin Browen, and you're watching The Conspiracy Files. All right, guys, so on today's episode, we are going to be dissecting a very, very sordid affair, once again, that exposes that was in operation in the 90s, 80s in the Netherlands. And this one is incredibly disturbing. And the suspicious deaths that surround this whole thing, the evidence that was thrown out, the lack of convictions, the murders, This is an incredibly deep and dark story that sounds absolutely unbelievable. But once again, as you've probably noticed on this show, the more unbelievable a story sounds, to me, the more likely it is to be true. And this is absolutely insane. I mean, the documentation and the evidence of this whole thing, there's just so much of it. And there's just such a lack of justice in all of these stories. It always leaves me scratching my head because I can't understand why adults turn their backs on children and why adults in power turn a blind eye to and let them continue operating, especially in these networks, completely unimpeded. Before we start today, if you're watching the show on YouTube, please leave me a comment. Comment your thoughts on this whole thing because it helps boost the engagement. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and like the video. Seriously, just do it right now before this starts. Go like the video, leave me a comment, pause the video and come back. It really helps this channel grow, and I need your guys' help because these platforms that this is being posted on, they don't necessarily want to recommend this content to people because it's exposing a lot of things that a lot of people would rather stay in the shadows. And also, if you're listening to the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever, please be sure to leave me a 5-star review. All that stuff just helps so much. But without further ado, let's get into the story of the bulletin boards and the rings. To start this whole thing out, we have to talk about the Morkoven work group and Marcel Vervlossem. According to a 2018 article in ENR, in 1989, Marcel Vervlossem, with the help of a few residents and friends from his community of Morkoven, Belgium, decided to create the non-profit association Work Group Morkoven Nationaal in order, initially, to combat the violence inflicted on children in the Antwerp Psychiatric Hospital, the Algemeen Kinderziekenhuis Anderweppen Good Angles. I hope I said a little bit of that correct. Through his professional experience, Marcel was already very interested in runaway and missing children, particularly the ASBL Ganymedes, an association that was a front to very easily attract many children that they then for use in a Alerted in 1990 by Morkoven Association, the Belgian authorities initially refuted these accusations before definitively putting an end to the activities of the ASBL Ganymedes in 1996. In 1992, while continuing its investigation into the environment of this association, the work group Morkoven uncovered between Portugal and Belgium, between Madeira and Temse. In the city of Temse, Marcel identified two hubs of the Monte and Gaiati cafes. Marcel decided to put pressure on the pimps of these two cafes in order to obtain more information from them. The owner of the Monte Cafe, a man named Dirk Tahen, then tried to turn the situation to his advantage by filing a complaint against the former private detective for blackmail, which ended up getting him prosecuted and convicted of blackmail and fraud, thanks to the production of the criminal record of a namesake. Dirk, the owner of that cafe, would later admit to a journalist that he had produced a false testimony to protect one of his friends who was in the network. And it wasn't until 1998 when Marcel and his group announced that they had dismantled a network, which caused quite a stir in the post-Dutroux era in Belgium. In fact, Marcel was recorded in a television interview speaking about his discovery. Take a look.
Marcel believes these are just the tip of the iceberg.
Dat de films die gevonden zijn.
We know that in certain bars in Amsterdam, other films shot in Madeira were also shown. It's clear there were more films made. Because the films were found in different locations, there was obviously material which was distributed and sold. I don't know how many films we're talking about here. All I know for sure is that it involved dozens of children.
Now, Marcel had been quoted saying that he had cracked, quote, one of the most extensive and violent rings ever discovered, end quote, according to an article in The Guardian. He said, quote, we've been fighting the police for years, but now this means our work hasn't been for nothing, end quote. As a result of this bust, German Chancellor Helmut Kohl immediately ordered a nationwide offensive aimed at fighting producers and who were posting this sick content on the internet, which was growing at the time. And now we get to Lothar Glandorf. Lothar Glandorf worked in the that Marcel busted between Holland and Belgium, operating a brothel at age 36 and a bar called Le Pinocchio in Berlin, Germany. It's an eerie name if you know about Pinocchio and the story behind that. After ignoring complaints about this bar and how they were children for 18 months, the Rotterdam police finally targeted Lothar and found that he had been hundreds of boys. Nearly half of the boys that the local police discovered that Lothar had or was actively were under the age of 16 years old, and one of the victims was only 9. After this discovery, the police tapped Lothar's phones and heard a customer ask him for, quote, a young boy, a very nice young boy, a nice little blonde one who can stay the night, end quote, and another prepubescent boy who, quote, you know, no hair, end quote. Those are direct words from these. The investigators also heard Lothar tell one boy that if he tried to run away, he would send his family the photos that he was in possession of him. Another young victim was told he'd be in the head if he ever went to the authorities. The police reported that, quote, even if Lothar Glandorf knew the perversions of a customer, he would still send a young boy to a customer who had a sexual preference for sadomasochism. Glandorf had one customer who specialized in deflowering young boys, end quote. In one of Lothar's houses, they found an unmailed letter from a Turkish boy called Attila, written to a young girl named Asam. Don't feel bad about me, he wrote in the letter. Things are the way they are, and there's nothing to be done about it. You can do what you want. Don't be sad. Authorities eventually found the same boy in the video, with his wired to a whining electric generator while a Belgian customer him. Keep in mind, this was on tape. That sad note that you just read from a victim to another victim. Yes, they eventually located that child, and he had electric wires wrapped around, while at the same time, an adult Belgian male was him. Now, it wasn't until the mid-1990s when Marcel ended up investigating Manuel Shadwald's disappearance, and this came after he discovered Lothar Glandorf's name in a 1992 police report detailing a raid on an underage party in the Dutch town of Waller, associated with the Temse Madeira case. The report that Marcel came across stated that Lothar Glandorf had been arrested at the party in the company of a teenager named Robbie Vanderplanken, and that at this party, where there were adults and plenty of young male children, they were watching videos, and the adults were taking turns Marcel immediately made the connection based on the party guests that he read about that this party was related to the Temse network, which he had busted just recently. And that network, he knew, had sent underage boys to Holland and many others across Germany and the Netherlands. Marcel ended up saying, quote, "Internet children, kidnapping of children, babies who get children who are tied down, and not the same as the usual milieu. What we are dealing with here are very serious cases indeed, where there is no respect for the children whatsoever, and a child can be kidnapped from a street corner." End quote. So Marcel had been investigating this stuff for a while with his group that he formed to combat child. And that's when he came across that connection between the ring that he had just actively tried to bust and another independent ring that was in operation with this really, really bad guy, Lothar Glandorf. And remember, at that party, there was Lothar, there was obviously other adults, lots of people there, children, and there was also that teenager, Robbie van der Planken. Now, Robbie was a Belgian runaway who assisted Lothar Glandorf with his between Holland and Belgium. Robbie started working in the city's when he was only 12 years old, and Robbie was first identified when Marcel decided to release one of the faces in the file for public identification. In a later interview, Marcel related how Robbie captured his victims. Take a look.
Marcel has few doubts that the film produced in '91 by De Rijk and Van der Naten is typical of materials sold in some Amsterdam bars, which promotes the image of Madeira as a paradise.
Dus de bedoeling is waarschijnlijk geweest dat
The intention was like, here are some videos, we filmed it ourselves, what do you think of it? See how easy it is to pick up a child. We don't have to pay them much. We give them a little something to eat, some clothes, a few coins, a few cigarettes, and we'll go with you. It's very easy. This was their intention. They filmed their own material, demonstrating how easy it is to children, how they could easily find children, and how Madeira could become a focal point for all. All you need is a few coins, a few cigarettes, and they'll go with you.
Now, very quickly, members of the public identified Robbie van der Planken, and Marcel and his team tracked him down in Amsterdam in June of 1998. Marcel, at the time, was able to locate Robbie and ambushed him with questions about Manuel Shadwell during a TV interview filmed by journalists from the Belgian public broadcaster RTBF. During this impromptu ambush interview, Robbie snitched on a man named Norbert de Rick and gave Marcel and the journalists accompanying him a tape that he had in his possession entitled Madeira. Now, it should be noted, this guy Robbie snitched on camera named Norbert de Rick, he was at that party with Lothar and Robbie and all those children that we were just talking about. He was on the arrest reports, so he was already a known suspect here, but Robbie, when he's ambushed in the street, just decides to open up to Marcel and gives him a lot of details about Norbert and the ring that he's operating, and he also decided to give him that VHS tape, which had scribbled on it the word Madeira. Now, after this interview and after taking this information to the authorities, the police discovered that Norbert was not only a collector of but he also made several short with underage boys on the Portuguese island of Madeira in 1991. A journalist ended up reporting on this island in Portugal, saying,
"But in many cases, parents are turning a blind eye to the abuse of their children. This shocking video, which came to light recently, shows activities with 10 and 11-year-old boys. It was made by a Dutchman and a Belgian, and was distributed in Amsterdam. Robert van der Naten and Norbert de Rijk have been making films in Madeira since the early 90s. Their hunting ground is Camara dos Lobos, and their meetings with boys are later sold to the underground trade. At first we thought they weren't. They asked us to go for a walk, to go to the hotel and have dinner. So we went to the hotel, only I didn't know they were. They started having sex with these guys, and I went to take a bath. They were filming, and later gave me the camera so that I could film them. Then they filmed me, and that was it. They were having sex. What kind of sex? I don't know, sex. One told me to take off my clothes, and I said I'm sorry I won't. I was nervous, because I was a minor. I was scared. But afterwards, I took them off. Marcel Vervlogen is an anti-campaigner from the headquarters of Merkhoven, a Belgian non-governmental organisation. His investigations into the disappearance of minors unearthed an international network covering Holland, Germany and Portugal. In the subsequent raids, the police found several videos produced in Madeira,
In 1997, the Portuguese police obtained a copy of these tapes, which depicted Norbert, the adult children, and they immediately began publicizing what they had found. And 5 years after the first revelations to the Belgian justice system, Portuguese authorities decided to pursue the members of the Temse Madeira network by issuing international arrest warrants. Finally, under media pressure, the Belgian justice system officially recognized the cases. Keep in mind, Marcel had been talking about this network officially for years. He and his group had been trying to bust this thing. They had been trying to raise the alarm in Belgium and the Netherlands, and nobody wanted to do anything about it. It was only after they ambushed this guy and got a copy of this tape and gave the tape to authorities, and the authorities in another country investigated it, that the Belgian authorities finally took some sort of action. And this was an absolute wildfire. In the wake of these revelations, many were arrested, and at least 340 different victims were identified. Victims that had been filmed as they were by trusted adults. Additionally, Marcel's associates in the Werkhoven group noticed an interested onlooker nearby and decided to follow this onlooker to a Dutch seaside resort town called Zandvoort. This guy had been watching them conduct this interview. He was really interested in acting suspiciously. Marcel's associates noticed him watching them and Robbie, and so when they all left and they noticed that the guy had stayed for their entire conversation and seemed concerned or really interested, they followed him. And when they arrived in this resort town called Zandvoort, they found the man. His name was Gerrit Jan Ulrich, and he was a 49-year-old computer technician who owned a computer store called Cube Hardware, and who ironically ended up being Robbie Vanderplanken's longtime lover. So he was interested in the interview because he had been teenager Robbie's longtime lover. So immediately you can assume that he's involved in the. But this is when it gets crazy. Now, according to the book Eye of the Chicken Hawk, written by Simon Dovey, which is an incredible book, which I highly recommend everybody who's watching this channel go read. It's like one of the Bibles on this whole thing. Gerrit Jan Ulrich invited Marcel Vervlossum to his apartment in June of 1998. That's right, Gerrit knew that Marcel was onto him. He knew that the jig was up, and he just ended up inviting Marcel in. He lived in an apartment above the computer store, and what was about to happen was absolutely mental. Marcel entered Gerrit's apartment to have this talk with him, and Gerrit revealed to him that he was an administrator of a massive worldwide website called the Apollo Bulletin Board Service. The Apollo boards ensured the commercial distribution of materials. To gain access to this stuff, could dial up, pay a fee, and then gain access to tens of thousands of illegal photographs and videos of children being in the most unthinkable, violent, disturbing ways. Gerrit also gave Marcel a computer disk, which he claimed contained more than 9,000 images of children, including some images and videos which depicted brutal, bloody of babies and children, and this was later referred to as the Zandvoort CD. Additionally, Gerrit gave Marcel discs with information on all of the producers who had produced these videos and photos, and lists of other who had paid to access these files from around the world. Marcel believed that Gerrit had disclosed all this information because he was scared for his own life and was seeking out some kind of life insurance against a network of producers who produced the materials that he was in charge of distributing online. So you got to keep this in mind. Marcel and his team follow this guy back to his computer shop after they notice him acting sketchy. They discover that he's the longtime lover of the guy that they were ambushing on the street. He invites him into his apartment. He lives above the computer store, and it's there that he reveals that he's in like the mouth of hell. He's in the pit of vipers. It's in this apartment where one of the largest websites is run from. There's tens of thousands, millions of images that are hosted on the servers surrounding him. He's handed discs with the names of the people who produce this stuff, with the names of the customers that consume this stuff, and with the materials themselves. Additionally, it was also reported that Gerrit supposedly had AIDS and heart disease and didn't have a lot of time to live anyway. So maybe he was coming clean because he felt bad at the end of his life that he had lived his life as a supervillain. After this short talk, Gerrit reportedly fled the apartment and later contacted Marcel by telephone to tell him about a cache in his apartment that concealed other documents, photos, videos, and more. A few days later, after Gerrit made this phone call to Marcel, his dead body was discovered in an Italian forest on June 20th, 1998. He had been shot multiple times. And the Italian police eventually arrested Robbie van der Placken, the guy who Marcel had interviewed, who was the longtime lover of Garrett, as a suspect in his murder. Later on, Robbie admitted to helping Lothar Glandorf transport Manuel Shadwald, that young boy from Germany, from Berlin, Rotterdam. Then he admitted in an unaired interview on Dutch television that Manuel Shadwald had been sold to Warwick Spinks. If you guys don't know who Warwick Spinks is, one of my biggest videos on this channel is about him and about the network that he was involved in at this same time period. I didn't talk about this stuff when I did that initial episode, but if you don't know anything, Warwick Spinks is like the definition of evil. He was a serial and a consumer and producer who massively profited from the sale and production of, which is essentially where somebody is on camera for the pleasure of those who watch it. Afterwards, Marcel knew that there was more to this story, and it was just getting darker and darker. So you know how Garrett told Marcel about those other discs and documents that were in his apartment on that phone call? Well, Marcel eventually drove all the way down to the seaside town and broke into Garrett's apartment. He wanted to retrieve those discs and documents. However, when he arrived, he was caught by the police breaking into the apartment. That's because the police had recently been informed that Garrett had been found murdered, so they were staking out his apartment to see if any other people that were involved in this thing would pay it a visit. And unfortunately, Marcel ended up being the guy that went in to break in and retrieve all the documents and information. That surveillance team had been assigned to monitor the apartment, and they witnessed Marcel breaking in. So they ended up going in with him. After looking through Garrett's apartment, they found up to 20 more discs, which contained more than 100,000 films and images that depicted extremely violent. And additionally, they found garbage bags full of child's clothing. It's unknown what the uses of this clothing was, who this clothing belonged to, or what, but I'm talking large bags full of young children's clothes. The Dutch justice system, which recovered between 100 and 200,000 other photos and videos, later identified 472 unique children's faces in the videos and photos, including around 20 French victims. However, because of the number of photos found, the Dutch and Belgian authorities had failed in comparison. And when one reads that there were links in the files to the British Amsterdam predator ring that was being run by Warwick Spinks, there were links between this ring and a person who procured high children for high-level officials, aka Lothar, an anonymous contact of the Dutch royal family, and one of the girls named by X1, things suddenly start to make more sense. In Simon Dovey's Eye of the Chicken Hawk, a child psychiatrist who ended up inspecting the materials found by Marcel stated that he had, quote, never seen anything like this. The pictures show very disgusting things. Violence and the tying up of young children. There were children aged 4 to 5, children aged 8 to 9, and I saw one child about 18 months. Some films were described as almost killing, as very special, very aggressive, very hard, and mechanically brutal. Those were the names given to these films and photos, written sometimes on the discs or on the files on the computer when these things were analyzed. Files that were titled almost killing, very special, mechanically brutal. Downright disturbing. Now, after Garrett had given Marcel those tapes, Marcel took them back to the Morkoven Work Group Association, his anti-child association he started up, and those discs and documents were then given to his colleague, a woman named Gina Pardains-Bernaire, a computer specialist who made copies of all the files and documents before they were handed over to the police. Gina had worked very closely with Marcel on the Manuel Shadwald case and had joined the Morkoven Work Group in July of 1998, when the time of the Zandvoort network was discovered. She had been a key investigator in the network when she quickly discovered the implication of the German Secret Service by the means of Manuel Shadwald's father-in-law, a man named Rainer Wolf.
Gina Pardains byla sociální pracovnice, která pracovala s oběťmi, které byly v dětství sexuálně zneužívány. Pardains byla na částečný úvazek členkou skupiny Morkoven Work Group, která se zabývala odhalováním pachatelů zneužívání dětí. Pardains se svěřila několika přátelům, že viděla nahrávku dětské pornografie, na které byla zachycena i vražda jedné z obětí během orgií. Na nahrávce údajně poznala jednoho z pachatelů, společníka Michela Nihula.
But this is when things really started to get strange for Gina. Remember, Gina had a very important role in this whole thing because she backed up all of those files that had been handed to Marcel. So this was the evidence of all the people who were implicated in this production ring, all the people implicated in this ring, not only the names of the people who helped run this thing, the operators, the guys behind the cameras, the guys who even did like the sound, as disturbing as that is, sound guys who filmed this stuff, but also the client list of all the people who had purchased these things, who dialed up and downloaded these materials, everything. So these were very, very sensitive documents and files that Gina had messed with. And after she copied all of this stuff and took possession of it, Gina started to have telephone, fax, and computer disturbances. And she started receiving phantom phone calls. She told all the members of the Morkoven group about this, including Marcel. She frequently reported that after taking possession of those materials, copying them, and aiding in this investigation, she started receiving phone calls from random people with unlisted numbers at all times of the day. When she would pick up the phone call, it would just be breathing. Somebody on the other end of the line, silent. She would ask them who they are, try to get details, but they would suddenly hang up. And now this is interesting. So they took this stuff to the authorities and they told them that she had been, receiving these phone calls and they were afraid. And they went to Belgacom, which was the state telephone company, basically like the Verizon or AT&T in Belgium. But they claimed that after investigating these phone calls, they couldn't find who had placed the calls in the first place. They also couldn't figure out why her telephone service kept going in and out, why her computer service kept going in and out. They couldn't figure any of that stuff out, and they couldn't tell her the number that those phone calls had come from. They basically said, yeah, we can see that it's happened, but we don't know what's causing any of it, and we don't know who the people are that are calling you. So they were useless. However, their investigation had carried them to discover a second line would have been open on her phone without her ever having ordered it, and that there would have been a small wire detached. So someone had opened up a second line on Gina's phone, which is really bizarre, and she obviously hadn't done this. And they said that someone would have had to actually mess with her phone, detach a wire inside of her phone. Remember, this is back in the 90s, so they weren't like iPhones and stuff. These phones all had wires and completely different operating systems and technological setups. Now, on November 13th, Gina Bernier made a copy of one of those Zandvoort CDs and sent it to the organization, the International Committee for the Dignity of the Child, or CIDE, in Geneva, Switzerland, which in turn communicated that device, handed it over to Interpol, or the International Police. After Gina made copies of the Zandvoort CDs and sent them away, that's when those strange things started to happen. For example, one day Gina told her friends and family that a group of shadowy men had tracked her down at a train station and told her to stop copying the discs and stop researching the case. That's right, she was sitting waiting on a train when this group of frightening men approached her and told her basically to back down. She also told friends and family that shortly afterwards she was followed by an unmarked car, which ended up being a gray Mercedes. A Mercedes which ended up being registered to a former driver of the bar Dolo, or the Brussels headquarters of Michel Nihoul, where it's alleged that he would meet all the police officers who were involved in sabotaging the Dutroux case. Now keep that in mind. Michel Nihoul is the ghoul, the victim behind Marc Dutroux's huge Belgian network, and I've talked extensively about Dutroux on this channel and my other channels. That's the most infamous case in Belgium. The car that was following Gina, which is a completely different ring, was owned by the owner of the bar that is frequented by Michel Nihoul, the guy who was the mastermind of the Marc Dutroux ring. So it seems like these two things are related. Remember, Marc Dutroux, they were filming their stuff, and the Marc Dutroux ring went all the way to the upper echelon of the Belgian government. This went to kings, this went to princes, this went to powerful businessmen and CEOs and government officials and judges, but it wasn't necessarily exclusively producing. So it's really interesting that Dutroux and Michel Nihoul are tied into this ring, where it seems the emphasis was on producing and everything, which is something that people have alleged Dutroux and Nihoul were into this whole time. But that's just kind of a bit of a red herring. But let's get back to the main story that we're talking about, these Apollo bulletin boards. Gina refused to back down, even though she had received all these weird phone calls on the phone, been approached by people at the train station, been followed in her car. And at this point, she kept investigating this ring, kept making noise about it, and her harassments over the telephone increased. She began receiving anonymous death threats. from people whose voices were deformed by electronic equipment.
So she'd receive messages like this.
You pick up the phone.
Drop this or I'm going to kill you.
You know, like that. Now, on one occasion, Gina received 2 of those calls in one day. And after following those calls, Gina's son, who was out riding his bicycle, was bumped by a car whose driver fled without stopping. Gina then filed a police report. That's right after one of those calls, Gina's son was out riding his bike. Someone tried to hit him with their car. They knocked him off of his bike. She then filed the police report. And on November 14th, 1998, Gina called Jan Boykins, the president of the Morkoven group, Marcel's group, but she had difficulty understanding Jan Boykins over the phone. According to him, Gina said, "With what I found, either Belgium explodes or I am murdered." End quote. So at this point, Gina's getting many threats on her life. Someone tried to hit her child with a car. She's getting anonymous death threats from people using voice scramblers. She's being approached by people in person at the train station, followed by cars. On November 14th, she calls into the Morkoven group and tells them about all this stuff that's happening, but it's hard to understand her phone call, almost as if someone has bugged her line or is obscuring what she's trying to tell the person on the other end. And the day after that phone call, one day after Gina called someone from the group and said, "Either Belgium explodes or I am murdered," her car is found crushed underneath a bridge. A news report from the day states, Gina Brunner, the Flemish children's rights activist who was responsible for the discovery of a large network in Zandvoort in the Netherlands in the summer of this year, died in a traffic accident over the weekend. She crashed into a bridge pillar in Lembeek at quite high speed and died instantly. There's no indication of a murder. Police assume that Gina Brunner was driving too fast in the rain on a slippery road surface, which also explains why no skid marks were found. In the days and weeks before her death, Gina told several people that she had been receiving death threats. On Saturday, she called Marcel Vervlossum twice about this from the Morkoven Working Group, the nonprofit organization that received diskettes with 9,000 gruesome images in the summer. The contacts were then made by Gina Brunner, who had been searching for the teenage boy Manuel Shadwald, who disappeared in Berlin in 1993. Marcel very much doubts that it was an accident, and yesterday plainly spoke of another murder. Several other children's rights activists in Brussels confirmed yesterday that Gina Brunner had been living in fear in recent weeks and openly said she feared for her life, although these statements were not always taken seriously. End quote. From an article right after she died. Then, almost 2 decades later, an article that was published in July of 2015 reported that, quote, Gina Pardains Brunner worked intensively on the Shadwald and Dutroux cases in the 1990s and wanted to prove a connection between the murders even back then. She sought contact with private investigators and journalists. Also told us about having the video with Manuel Shadwald. You know, things are getting more and more dangerous. I get death threats. I was also approached by American Secret Service agents. They want to put the film and me into the witness protection program for it, end quote. Said Gina Pardains Brunner in her home in Herney in October 1998. Her husband stood next to her and said worriedly, "I'm afraid for her." A few weeks later, the woman driving her car crashed into a bridge pillar without braking. One day before her death, on November 13th, 1998, her house was broken into. Was it about the movie? A day after her death, she was scheduled to appear for questioning at the Belgian police, end quote. So Gina Brunner is telling people for weeks she's receiving death threats, is getting approached by people. The day before her death, her house is broken into by people who seem to be looking for something. Her telephone is getting bugged. She's getting all of these calls. And then the day before, she's set to actually go into the Belgian police department to tell them what she knows about this whole thing, give them all the information that she's gathered on the Apollo bulletin boards and these networks. The day before she's supposed to go do that at the police headquarters, she runs at a high speed into a pillar in her car and dies. Does that seem like something that Gina would do? Go at high speed on the road on a rainy night and run directly into a pillar the day before she's supposed to testify after getting death threats for weeks? Well, according to Belgian police, that's what happened. There's no suspicious anything around her death. There's no foul play. They're not suspicious that someone killed her to this day. Just an accident. Now, interestingly enough, Gina later appeared in a 2001 documentary about Marc Dutroux by Pete Ekman, who claimed that Gina was another circumstantial death who knew too much information regarding the ring.
Sie wurde zu oft bedroht, als dass so ein blöder Autounfall noch einigermaßen glaubwürdig wäre. Für mich ist das ausgeschlossen. Ich glaube, dass böse Absicht im Spiel war.
Dass sie umgebracht wurde?
Ich glaube, sie wurde ermordet.
When the Rotterdam police were looking for Manuel Shadwell, police logs which were linked to the Dutch TV program Network suggested that 3 different officers saw Lothar Glandorf, that pimp, with a boy who they all believed was Manuel Shadwell, but they failed to rescue him. That's right, these 3 officers saw Lothar Glandorf, this infamous man who's known to be with a young boy who looked like a very famous, highly publicized missing boy, and they didn't do anything to save the child. An article suggested that the officers and the police officers were reluctant to break their cover for the fear of jeopardizing their undercover operation. Upon seeing the boy, they asked for urgent advice from senior officers. They received no advice, and they then watched as Lothar Glandorf grabbed the boy, loaded him up into his car, and then drove away. The Rotterdam police had massively dropped the ball. And after this, Manuel Shadwell was never seen again, and he was never found. Now, Gina Berner's car crash and her death was named as suspicious. News reports at the time indicated that there was no brake impression, which indicated that Gina had tried to stop, which could have indicated sabotage in her death. Another report indicated that Gina's brakes had gone out, but in Simon Dovey's Eye of the Chicken Hawk, the author notes that, quote, according to friends and colleagues, Berner had spoken of a found on the Apollo discs of a young girl being by an acquaintance of Michel Nehoul during a party in 1996. This was later believed to be Katrine de Coop, who had last been seen making a phone call, where 2 studios linked to Garrett's Apollo bulletin boards operation had been located. She was a part of the network that Marc Dutroux and Michel Nehoul managed. Additionally, Simon Dovey claimed that Gina Berner became one of the more than 20 accidental and sudden deaths linked to the Marc Dutroux case. We've talked about that before. So let's talk about that for 1 second. Katrine de Coop. She's a young victim who disappeared, and she made a phone call. It's a big part of her disappearance. And the building that she made the phone call from was the home of 2 production studios that were linked to the bulletin boards, to the case that we're talking about here. They were 2 production studios that produced for those websites to be distributed. And Gina had allegedly found a video on the Apollo bulletin boards that depicted that young girl being on camera. And that young girl has been linked to Marc Dutroux and Michel Nehoul. So that link would have been crucial to prove that Marc Dutroux and Michel Nehoul were a part of a much larger operation. I mean, they're already known to be part of a massive production and, murder and operation. But this would have expanded the investigation in a huge way. And then Gina's dead. Additionally, an investigation was later launched into Gina's death regarding the threats she had received prior. In the De Morgan newspaper reported, quote, a judicial investigation is underway at the Brussels Public Prosecutor's Office into the death threats that child rights activist Gina Berner received in the last days and weeks of her life. De Morgan has learned the case is in the hands of investigating Judge Edith Callawert. She will try to determine what exactly is the meaning of the accusations that Gina herself made about a second telephone line on her private number through which email messages were allegedly intercepted, telephone threats, and an incident in which her son was driven off the road. The woman was an employee of the RTBF program Fates Divers, helped the nonprofit organization Morcoven in its investigation into the so-called Apollo network, and before her death alluded to an important discovery that she had made on the sidelines of the Marc Dutroux case. End quote. This indicated that the death threats and the mysterious circumstances surrounding Gina's stories and car accident and death may not have been a coincidence after all. As it turns out, the investigation into Gina's death additionally led the Morcoven work group to a transgender person in Amsterdam named Robert Jan Warmerdam, who claimed to have known not only Robert van der Planken, the guy who they initially ambushed and asked about his connection to Manuel Shadwell, but also to Marc Dutroux. Now, I know I've mentioned Marc Dutroux and Michel Nehoul a lot in this episode. Marc Dutroux is the most infamous in my mind in all of Europe, and he was kind of the fall guy for a massive high-profile celebrity royal ring that did all these rituals and children, and they wore masks and did hunting parties, and there were hundreds and hundreds of perpetrators and thousands of victims. If you want to learn about Marc Dutroux, you should definitely watch the video that I've already done about him, because it's crazy. But you just need to know that Marc Dutroux is like the most infamous in all of Belgium. So a connection to Marc Dutroux in this case is world changing. I mean, this is absolutely insane stuff. So after they learned about this person named Robert Jan Warmerdam, the Werkhoven group, after Gina's death, began to compile a dossier on information that they provided to them. Included in the dossier was information on their lead in Amsterdam, along with 20 CD-ROMs of files that were taken from the Apollo discs. So after all this was said and done, after testimony was recorded, after all the files, including these videos and photos and everything, was secured, the Werkhoven group sent that dossier of information to a man named Michel Bourlet, who was a prosecutor who at the time was overseeing the Marc Dutroux case in 2001. In the book The Eye of the Chicken Hawk, Simon Dovey reports that this dossier would later be leaked to the press in the lead up to Dutroux's trial in 2004, then to the public via WikiLeaks in 2009. Warmerdam's dossier stated that Marc Dutroux had frequented a local nightclub in Amsterdam called G-Force, as well as two hardcore studios called Rex Productions and Roxanne Films. The G-Force Club was owned by an American named John Edward Mullaney, who could apparently be linked to John Stamford's Spartacus network through a company called Corper and Lorver. Remember, the Spartacus network I talked about in the Elm Guesthouse network, that was another network that was in operation in Europe that had ties to Frank Sheldon, who was running the network in Detroit, Michigan, and all of America. Let's make this very clear. There's the Marc Dutroux network, there's the Apollo network, which is what we're talking about this whole episode, and then there's the Spartacus network, which is the Elm Guesthouse. If you haven't watched that video, watch that as well. So the owner of the bar that Marc Dutroux from the Dutroux network frequented was a guy named John Edward Mullaney, who was linked to the Spartacus network, which operated all throughout Europe and, at the Elm Guesthouse in England. And through all this information, they're about to be connected to the Apollo bulletin boards, which brings all these together. John Edward Mullaney, the owner of that G-Force bar, could also be connected to a man named Carol Maxdam through another company called Adonis Roxanne, which was located in a building owned by Didier Pelerin, who had been interviewed by investigators back in 1996 regarding Marc Dutroux. And the investigators at the time confirmed that a woman named Marlene de Coker had worked there. Marlene was the mistress of Michel Nehoul, the ringleader of the Marc Dutroux ring, which Marc Dutroux took the fall for, which we've obviously talked about before. So in that bar that is connected to the Spartacus network with the Elm Guesthouse that spreads all across England, which also connects to Mork Spinks, in that bar, the mistress of Michel Nehoul, the leader of the Dutroux network, she works there. So that's a direct connection between those groups. Warmerdam, that transgender whistleblower, also reported that Marc Dutroux had spoken frequently about a nursery located near Roxanne Films, that production studio, where infants were procured and used for filming, sometimes brutally violent, they added. Among the materials that were seized at Garrick Van Ulrich's apartment, the original guy in this story who, called Marcel in to tell him the truth and then was found dead, inside of his apartment were found videos and photos of this type, including depicting the graphic of babies, as well as a document on the Apollo discs that detailed a list and a basic how-to guide on how to access infant children for. This nursery was eventually located by investigators and was found to be called Geno's Neufel Paradise Creche, and in 2010, it was later determined that infamous Robert Mickelson, dubbed the Monster of Riga by the media, would use that very nursery to procure babies for use in distributed online. So essentially, it was alleged years before that Marc Dutroux had used this very nursery to procure babies to be, whether they're or on camera or whatever, as a part of his own ring. Marc Dutroux frequented this place. They didn't really look into it or investigate it. And then like a decade later, it was discovered that another infamous just so happened to actually use that same nursery for the exact same thing, basically corroborating the earlier story, proving that the link between Dutroux and this place was legit. That dossier that was turned in with all these allegations in it served as a basis for many media reports in 2004, which then linked Marc Dutroux back to child in Amsterdam, but many questioned how much of it was actually true. In fact, during Robbie Vanderplanken's trial, his father told the media if Robbie spoke, that a true case wouldn't be anything against him. And he said that his son was in a movie where a child was. In an interview with the newspaper shortly afterwards, Robbie's father confirmed, saying, "There is a video in which a boy from Berlin dies. I saw it and recognized my son as the actor in it." Ugh. That gives me chills to imagine seeing your own son doing that. Additionally, Robert Jan Warmerdam, the whistleblower who helped start this whole dossier off, they claimed in the dossier that they had seen that film as well. Quote, and Robert Jan W. also describes scenes from this film. The investigation file from the Neufchâteau Public Prosecutor's Office states that the video was filmed in a bungalow near Amsterdam. The then 13-year-old boy from Germany initially refused to satisfy the perverse desires of several men on camera, but he was forced to do so and suffocated. This statement is also available to the public prosecutor in Haarlem, Netherlands, end quote. Now, interestingly enough, this same description of the film where a young boy in a bungalow refuses to go along with what these men wanted and they then him and beat him to death. That same description was given by an informant named Edward during the Operation Framework investigation into Warwick Spinks, that infamous film producer. Weird connection enough. Only the setting had changed in this testimony. He said, quote, a man puts a boy on a boat. The child suffocates. Panic breaks out on board. The camera falls over, end quote. At this point, Warwick Spinks started to haunt reports on the Manuel Shadwald case soon after news of Apollo Bulletin Board's investigation broke in 1998. And by this time, the authorities had finally traced the kidnapping of young Manuel Shadwald back to Lothar Glandorf. Remember, Lothar Glandorf is the guy we started off this whole thing with, the dude from Germany who was known for children to anybody that had money, who was caught on the phone children, who was seen with Manuel Shadwald, and the police let him get away, who's connected to Warwick Spinks and all these other networks that we're talking about. They're all interconnected. Now, an associate of Lothar Glandorf's named Peter Goetjes was involved in boys across the Dutch-German border and said that Manuel Shadwald's biological father, Rainer Wolf, had been involved, that the boy hadn't been kidnapped, but that his father had sold him to the network. Later, sources within the Dutch intelligence agency provided more details on this. Apparently, Manuel Shadwald had been killed on a yacht called Der Apollo, owned by Gerrit Ulrich and his business partner, a Dutch accountant named Leo van Gasselt. Lots of connections there. Gerrit Ulrich is the guy who confessed at the beginning of our story to Marcel and handed Marcel the documents and everything and was found dead in the forest. Gerrit was allegedly the guy who owned the yacht that Manuel Shadwald was murdered on. And the yacht was named Der Apollo. Remember, the website that Gerrit ran was called the Apollo Bulletin Boards. Now, a 2015 article titled The Lost Children reported the following. Quote, if what several informants described to the Algemeen Dagblad and the Welt am Sonntag is true, then something terrible happened on this boat. Then it was the place where a boy, Manuel Shadwald, lost his life. A few rich customers from politics and society gathered there to hold a with several children in front of the camera. Then, after the crime, the ship was towed to a Dutch Navy military port and cleaned. It is unclear what became of the film footage. In fact, the suspicion was also confirmed by a Dutch intelligence officer who was willing to talk about the case just a few days ago. Manuel Shadwald died playing games on this boat. He says this is also documented in the files of the Dutch Secret Service. The body was then sunk into the sea. And he also says that the case was covered up because high-ranking people were involved. He doesn't say why he's breaking his silence now. End quote. It was later determined that this was the film that Gina Pardaeans-Bernayer had seen, and it was called The Poisoned Dwarf and distributed by Garo Video. How disturbing. I'm going to put on screen the actual cover from this. The Poisoned Dwarf. When you even just see the cover of something like that and you know what happens and who the people that created this thing are and what they did, it leaves an empty feeling in your soul. It leaves you feeling hollow. At least me. It leaves me feeling like, wow. Now, in the book The Eye of the Chicken Hawk, Dovey reports that, quote, it was reported in Germany that the finds in Zandvoort have nevertheless brought Garo Video into the spotlight. The alleged Robbie Vanderplanken, who is imprisoned in Italy because he is said to have shot his partner Gerrit Jan Ulrich, can be seen in at least 5 Garrow films. Someone was quoted at the time as saying, "The films were bought by a Dutch production company before my time in 1993. To his knowledge, there were no personal contacts between Garrow Video and Robbie Vanderplanken." So basically, this Garrow Video was a studio that specialized in this stuff, and they're the ones that financed and produced the snuff film of young Manuel Shadwald, which was filmed on this yacht in the middle of the ocean. And afterwards, they threw Manuel's body into the sea. They buried him at sea so he would never be found. And the people that were allegedly seen on video in that disturbing film were high-profile people in society. And remember, Warwick Spinks, the guy that we've talked about in another episode of the show and I've already talked about here, he was a guy who was getting the children to be used in those films. So Warwick Spinks is directly tied into all of this. And Warwick Spinks is tied into the Spartacus network in England. He's also been linked now to the True network. So all these people were abducting children, trading children, and then filming these children as they were. And the investigation into Warwick Spinks and TAG Films in 1993 led the German police to raid a video distributor in Dusseldorf, Germany, where Garrow Video, that company I was just talking about, was located. Afterwards, Garrow Video changed hands that same year and was identified as a producer in a dossier provided by Carol Masdam's accountant to Dutch intelligence services. All this suggests that Manuel Shadwald truly met his end with Warwick Spinks in Amsterdam. So Warwick Spinks is one of those bad guys that seems to pop up at the worst times in every terrible event. He's kind of like the Mothman, showing up when disasters happen and the worst things seem to happen. At the end of the day, Warwick Spinks was involved in multiple other films, but he was there and he helped finance and procure and set all this stuff up to produce The Poisoned Dwarf, that film that would end up showing the death of Manuel Shadwald. Now, Manuel's father, his name once again was Rainer Wolf. And it turned out that he had been an intelligence asset for the Stasis during the 1980s. The Stasi was the secret police and state security agency of East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic, from 1950 to 1990. This much the man admitted himself, saying that he had been used in the past to infiltrate various peace movements. However, a former liaison officer between the Stasi and KGB named Wanja Gotz then stated in an affidavit, quote, "I was commissioned by the GDR Secret Service to psychologically assess this man." She's talking about Rainer Wolf, Manuel's dad. "It was only much later that I found out that after his move to the Federal Republic of Germany in 1984, orchestrated by the Stasi, Rainer Wolf blackmailed Western Europeans on behalf of the GDR Secret Service's Foreign Espionage Service." End quote. The former head of West German intelligence during this period, Bernd Schmidbauer, took the Stasi conspiracy theory one step further and suggested that Mark Dutroux himself may have, quote, also worked for a time on behalf of the Stasi, telling the press, quote, "There were indeed indications that such information could be found in the Stasi material that was leaked to the American Secret Service, the CIA. The Belgian Secret Service would be well advised to evaluate these documents thoroughly," said Bernd, former intelligence coordinator of the Kohl government Schmidbauer. During the turning point, the CIA was able to secure extensive materials about the espionage department of the MFS reconnaissance headquarters. Because of the explosive nature of the information contained within those files, also the information about compromised Western European politicians who were closeted these documents are still withheld from the public, end quote. Claims made by a former German intelligence chief that Mark Dutroux may have had ties to the Stasi are also the giveaway. You see, Mark Dutroux was a rather marginal figure on the periphery of a much larger network that, if it had state-sponsored ties, was almost certainly aligned with NATO interests. Among the noted ties to Germany in the cases covered so far are the Elm Guest House, which I was just talking about, that we just talked about on the channel recently, which was owned by a German woman who died suddenly after passing along evidence that the guest house was set up as a Spartacus network operation, which produced compromising photographs and videos of British politicians who visited it. Spartacus International, an international was absorbed by a German holding company in the 1980s called Bruno Munder Verlag after their founder, John Stamford's child tourism operation was exposed and shut down. John Stamford himself fled to Germany after his estate was raided in Amsterdam, and he then died suddenly before his trial dealing with the Spartacus network and its connections commenced. British producers in Amsterdam accused of making films owned a video production company called TAG Films, TAG, linked to a German distribution company in Dusseldorf called Garo Video, the same company that produced The Poisoned Dwarf. Lothar Glandorf, the main guy that we talked about at the very beginning who abducted Manuel Shadwald, was a German national who operated child in both Berlin and Rotterdam and was boys to at least one senior Dutch government official. I'm sure there were plenty more too. And finally, Gerrit Ulrich, the man who was found dead in the Italian wilderness, who decided he was going to come clean about all this stuff to Marcel, he was a German national administrating a child distribution server who was murdered after handing over information about his associates to investigators. So what does all this mean? I don't know. That angle takes this whole thing out of the world of these people are really sick and twisted individuals that were able to manipulate these government officials into how much of this was funded by intelligence. Now, if you have your finger on the pulse here with all of these things, you know for a fact that Jeffrey Epstein was an intelligence asset. Whether he belonged to Israel or America fully, we don't really know. But Epstein was definitely procuring compromising blackmail materials of politicians to be handed over to intelligence services who would then own the politicians. And that same thing has happened with so many of these networks. They ended up being blackmail rings where they would entrap these powerful men. They would entice these powerful men with the option to live out their deepest, darkest fantasy. And while they were doing those things, they would record them and take photos of them, and they would then essentially own these people. So it all goes back to intelligence. The fact that Manuel Shadwald's father was an intelligence asset and that supposedly he himself had blackmailed politicians with that they had been recorded in, I mean, that just makes your head hurt. Because that means then that all of this stuff was essentially protected by intelligence agencies. That's really weird. It's almost like I've been saying this with every single video that I've produced. Even the Elm guest house, that whole situation in England, the house was fully set up with cameras and recording, and it was protected. Everyone was afraid to speak out about it. People were killed. People disappeared. People didn't talk about it. And every time they did talk about it, it would be shut down, even though there was tons of evidence. They were doing the same thing, catching these politicians or powerful people, even CEOs and business magnates. They were catching them on camera or video, children. And if you have that footage, if you have a photograph of a powerful person like that doing something like that to a child, you own them. If you want them to do something, you say, you need to lower the taxes on these people by 50% or this is getting leaked. Or you need to cut regulations here, or I'm going to leak this. Or you need to keep these people protected with impunity, rich, powerful billionaires, or this is going to be released. and it all ties in here with Manuel Shadwald, which also ties into Warwick Spinks, which ties into Mark Dutroux, which ties into the Elm Guest House, which ties into the Spartacus Network, which ties into Frank Sheldon. It's all interconnected. But we do have to talk about a few things. An article in the Independent UK, which came out in 1998, written by Tim Hulse, questioned Marcel's credibility, Marcel being the guy that busted this whole thing wide open, in the solving of the case. This article detailed Marcel's criminal history, which started in November 1979, in which an Antwerp court found him guilty of the following charges: housebreaking, forgery, fraud, extortion, criminal assault on a minor, and attempted arson. As a result, he was forced to spend time in a psychiatric institution. In 1982, Marcel set up an illegal ambulance service with his common-law wife, Elvira, in which they used to go shopping, making full use of siren and flashing lights to cut through traffic. In March of 1985, Marcel was found guilty of bouncing checks to the tune of nearly £1,650, as well as fraud relating to unemployment benefits. He was again, after this, institutionalized. When Marcel was out on probation, he set up a company to help people with problems of a social or material nature. This involved charging them a fee for writing letters of complaint to the European Court of Human Rights. In 1986, he staged a bomb threat. And in July of 1989, when Marcel was released from psychiatric care, a report described him as a fantasist and stated that he would, quote, probably always display unpredictable behavior. End quote. In 1991, Marcel was asked by a gay man in his 20s to recover some nude photos of him and his former lover. Later, Marcel demanded copies from them and asked for nearly £2,000, which was reluctantly handed over. The man later went to the police about this, about Marcel holding the photos basically for ransom, the nude photos, and Marcel appealed his conviction. But there's an article that was published in 2010 in Agora Vox that talks about Marcel, and it's pretty interesting. Here's a quote from it. It says, Marcel Vervloesem, who never missed a single opportunity to continue his activism, very intelligently took care to examine within the walls of the court, as the law allows him to do, the file of the criminal investigation conducted against him. He thus discovered that a Dutch police officer had filed with the registry diaries hundreds of photos and 27 videos of a nature, including the Madeira tape. The Morkoven Association knew that the Belgian authorities had in their possession all the information to investigate the Temse Madeira network. Unfortunately, he discovered that no investigation was being carried out to identify the criminals on the tapes, and therefore took the liberty of photographing and broadcasting for public identification one of the faces present in the case. Very quickly, feedback allowed Robert van der Plack, a Dutch, to be identified. End quote. So very quickly after Marcel published some of those images that were found on the Apollo discs, the feedback from the public had allowed Robert van der Plack, that Dutch, to be identified, which we talked about a long time ago, and that whole Madeira tape and Madeira ring was exposed. Now, in 1997, Marcel gave the Portuguese police a copy of the that he had received from the taking care to be filmed by the journalists to publicize the case. And it took 5 years for them to act on it. After the first revelations to the Belgian justice system, the Portuguese authorities finally decided to pursue the members of the Temse Madeira network by, like I said before, issuing those international arrest warrants. And after that, the Belgian justice system also officially recognized the case. So keep in mind, Marcel Vervloesem was the one who busted this whole thing open. He was the one who met with Gerrit Ulrich, the guy who handed him all of the discs. He was the one who busted open the Apollo case. He was hunting for justice for Manuel Shadwald. He was busting open the film network. This guy was working his whole decade to expose all of these things, and he had stumbled upon this massive network that he was set to expose. Then one of his partners in the work group, the Verkoven work group, died. Gina died when her car ran into a pole, which was obviously a total accident. Just kidding. I mean, obviously not. And he's done all of this work, but that also meant that he was at the time in possession of those CD-ROMs that contained hundreds of thousands of photos and videos. Because you see, he was nervous about handing this stuff over to the authorities. He thought that this was a big cover-up. Marc Dutroux, that was a huge thing that was happening at the time, and there was an obvious cover-up happening in Belgium. So the people that were involved in the Morkoven work group were all nervous that they'd hand over these discs to the authorities and they'd disappear, or they'd say, oh, we couldn't identify anybody, that's the end of that. And he was the one who initially published the face of Robbie van der Planken, which got him arrested and helped expose this whole thing even more. So once Marcel Vervloesem got possession of those 21 CD-ROMs, he made those copies of the materials with Gina, then informed the courts and the authorities, but he was suspicious and asked for guarantees from the police in order to hand them over. He asked them basically to guarantee that they would actually look into this stuff and that this wasn't just a ruse, that they weren't just going to take possession of this stuff and that it would disappear. And so, on July 14th, 1998, the Dutch channel Nova broadcast a report on the Apollo network and the recent discoveries of the association. Following this report, Marcel Vervloesem was immediately arrested and taken into custody by Belgian authorities on charges of possessing the 21 CD-ROMs full of, even though he was trying to do good things. A week or so later, on July 22nd, 1998, Marcel was released from police custody and told reporters on live TV that he was prepared to place his full trust in the courts in Belgium to dismantle this ring. And he then handed those CD-ROM copies over to the authorities. By the end of 1998, though, little legal action had been taken about that entire case. And in the meantime, Gina had been killed. April 11th, 1999, the Morkoven Work Group Association sent several copies of those CD-ROMs to the Belgian king, Albert II, his attorney general, and members of the French government. And at that point, Jacques Chirac's office acknowledged that they had received the discs and indicated that they had sent the CD-ROM to the Minister of Justice. But on April 12, 2000, about a year later, almost to the day, Elizabeth Guigou, then the Minister of Justice, declared she wasn't in possession of the Zandvoort materials. She had never received the disc. It seemed like the disc had somehow disappeared somewhere along the way, exactly what Marcel had been worried about the entire time. And this wasn't even a big deal. She just said, well, guess I don't have it, something happened to it, and they moved on. And finally, after an investigation into these discs was opened in France, and even though 42 children had been identified as appearing on those videos and photos by family members, a dismissal of the entire case was issued in 2002, and then a dismissal without further action on March 20th, 2003 by Judge Danielle Ringet. And finally, like clockwork, in 2008, the Belgian Attorney General responded and told the press, told journalists, announced that all of the documents relating to the Apollo bulletin boards, all the files with the names of the producers and the people who were filming this stuff and running the ring, all the files with the names of victims, and all the images and videos had disappeared. They were not in possession of any of the CDs. They were not in possession of any of the materials. It had all vanished from the official files. Keep in mind, those were the last copies of the discs, because Marcel had tried to save copies and tried to send these things to the right people. But every time he sent them and his group sent them to the authorities, they kept disappearing. And eventually Marcel was arrested for possessing that stuff, and he at that point had to turn everything over, and you know what happened. 2 years after Marcel Vervlossem publicly announced that his group, the Verkoven Work Group, had dismantled, he himself was accused of possessing materials and the of minors. His trial started in January of 2006, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison by the Antwerp Court of Appeals in 2008 for the of 4 children, the distribution of posters, and extortion, despite pleading not guilty. Some of these complaints were from people inside the Verkoven group, as well as by Marcel Vervlossem's own half-brother. However, most of these people went on to retract their own statements. So all these people had come forward and made all these allegations against Marcel, went on the record and said that all this stuff had really happened up until the point when he was convicted. And then later on, years later, they all retracted what they said and said, oh, that actually didn't happen. One victim of Marcel's even admitted later on to the authorities and to the press that he had received a payment of 375 euros to incriminate Marcel Vervlossem. And 4 doctors, in fact, testified later on to judges that the of the children were physically impossible to have happened due to Marcel Vervlossem's already fragile health. Then you had quote-unquote victims that testified that they had been paid to invent their stories. And you had the other people that had testified that they had seen and, heard things retracting their statements. But it didn't matter because Marcel had been locked away, the key had been thrown away, and he was written off as a crazy lunatic at that point. And above all else, dealing with this whole thing, the judge ordered a polygraph test. He wanted the people who were saying that Marcel had done this to them or they had seen Marcel doing these things. The judge wanted all of those people to be polygraph tested, and that polygraph test never happened. In the fall of 2010, Marcel was released on conditions, but in 2013, he ended up in prison when he was found guilty of on his underage nephew, who was 17. He was then afterwards acquitted in December 2014. Insane. So he was convicted again and then acquitted a year later. I don't know if this was all like intimidation. I don't want to write off if there was truth to any of these stories, but I mean, it's mental that this kept happening time and time again. It's well known that in 2009, Marcel had requested euthanasia after he was transferred from the medical department of the prison in Bruges to an observation cell. Additionally, a 2010 report by the president of the Verkoven group, Jan Boykins, stated that he believed that Marcel Vervlossem was jailed solely because they wanted to silence him about the CP case dealing with the Apollo bulletin boards and the films and Warwick Spinks and how big that thing was. And he even stated that he believes that dealing with the Apollo bulletin boards and all of those films, there was a total of over 90,000 child victims that had never received justice. The leader of the group also additionally claimed that he was not allowed to see Marcel in prison, claiming that he, quote, needed a proof of morality, and that the Verkoven group was forbidden to make any contact with Marcel. And in that prison of Hasselt, they promised at least 5 times that Marcel would be retransferred to the prison of Turnhout, but they lied, and the Belgian Minister of Justice, who wanted to cover up this entire case, knew that. The report went on to claim by Boykins that, quote, in 1998, Marcel Vervlossum, in the name of our association, Work Group Morkoven, transferred 7 CD-ROMs from the case Zandvoort to the Royal Palace. The Royal Palace let us kindly know that the CD-ROMs were transferred to the Attorney General of the court in Antwerp for judicial investigation. In 2008, Marcel Vervlossum and the High Council of Justice noted that the CD-ROMs and the exculpatory evidence from the criminal file of Marcel Vervlossum had disappeared. The king and the Royal Palace were informed. The government and the ministers of justice were contacted, but it remained silent about the disappearances. Marcel Vervlossum was soon imprisoned. So they sent these discs in. They tried to raise awareness about this whole thing. The government officials told the Morkoven work group that they had received the discs, and then the discs disappeared, and shortly afterwards, the guy leading the charge is imprisoned on the same charges that he's trying to allege high government officials were complicit in. And then you later find out that one of the victims was paid money to testify against him. All these people retracted their statements. The doctors said that these cases were impossible. He was then convicted of another crime and acquitted a year later. It's insane. So, at the conclusion of the Zandvoort case, the dismantling of the Morkoven group, and the imprisonment of Marcel Vervlossum, nothing happened to the international ring. No one was arrested. No one was taken in. None of this was ever officially even acknowledged. The files, the CD-ROMs, the discs disappeared. The evidence vanished into thin air. The governments imprisoned those who were fighting for the children. They let people go. They covered things up. Even though there's so much evidence, look at this entire episode. There's so much more that we could have gotten into, but nothing ever happened. It was just written off as some sort of a bad fever dream. It was one of many cover-ups. In fact, like so many more before it.
What do you think about these men? If I could kill them, I would. I hope I don't see them again, because I would go to prison for 30 years. Do you think you'll fire them? They me a lot. Do you ever think about it? I think about it all the time.
In January of 2024, Marcel Vervlossum died in his home at age of 65. Interestingly, his cause of death is unknown. Originally, an article posted in 2013 on Overblog announced that Belgacom, that Belgian television network that was launched in 1995, which handled Gina Pardaeans' phone lines that were being hacked, in 2013 it was announced they were closing the account of the work group Morkoven. And this account included thousands of web pages and blogs about the Zandvoort case, Belgian justice, policies, and prisons. The company was nearly 53% state-owned, yet they claimed that Morkoven had decided to close its own account. But Jan Boykins of Morkoven disagreed. So essentially in 2013, the state, telecommunications company said, we're closing down the Morkoven group's accounts, which meant removing all of these thousands of pages of evidence that they had gathered with quotes and documents and leaked things and portions of this story. We're closing down the web pages and we're wiping them from the internet because they said it was 53% state owned, which is interesting, right? And the head of the Morkoven group disagreed and said they didn't want to close it down. It had just been closed down out of the blue. They had wanted to keep that stuff up there to memorialize all of the hard work and keep raising awareness about what really happened. But nothing ever happened. And I'll leave you with a quote from Boykins' letter to the chairman of the European Parliament. As you know, the work group Morkoven has been taking action around an international network of for years. Hereby, missing youngsters and children are also traced. The actions and investigations of many years have finally led to the so-called Zandvoort case, where material was found in heaps. Although this work of the work group was generally praised and the investigator, Marcel Vervlossum of the work group Morkoven, was personally congratulated by the chairman of the European Union, the work group had to cope incessantly with opposition since 1992 on behalf of the Belgian justice and Belgian political authorities. The work group Morkoven not only became the victim of numerous insinuations and accusations, but was also regularly criticized by the Belgian Minister of Justice for the manner upon which the members of the work group spread rumors and tales full of fantasies. Following the Belgian Minister of Justice, the manner upon which the Union handled these files was unacceptable, and he had to offer resistance against this because it gave the impression that justice did not book any result." End quote. The minister could have summed up this problem better to the heart of the matter. There was never a serious search as to the solution of this problem. But at the end of the day, there's just so much here. I mean, there's still Warwick Spinks. Warwick Spinks, which we've talked about before, he was identified as one of the suppliers of the Apollo Bulletin Board films and images, and he was additionally named in Vanderplanken's address book. Warwick was a of grandiose ambition, a man who has commercialized his obsession, first by running a agency in Britain which sold boys to like-minded, and then by moving to Amsterdam, where, as The Guardian disclosed, he worked in brothels and joined a group of British men who produced videos in which 5 boys were alleged to have been for the pleasure of viewers. As Warwick approached the end of his 5-year sentence for the drugging and kidnapping of a 14-year-old boy, he was transferred from prison to a probation hostel in South London, where he was asked to fill in a form so that the police could enter his details on the new register of offenders. He's precisely the kind of compulsive offender for whom the register was designed, so that police can keep an eye on their own movements. Warwick Spinks, however, refused to fill in the form. He simply walked away from the hostel and sent his probation officer a postcard with an invitation to come see him in Amsterdam. Since then, he's traveled to Frankfurt, Johannesburg, Moscow, and Prague, pursuing his own special interests with never a care for the sex offenders registry or any other limb of the child protection system. He escaped. There's also Marc Dutroux and Michel Nahoul, who were tied into the Apollo bulletin boards. You know their story by now, but nothing ever happened with this whole connection. There were literal direct connections here that were never followed up on or are even really discussed when you deal with the Marc Dutroux case. And there's so many more people that got away with this. It is just mind-blowing. Time and time again, every single story that I cover on this, it's like I present you guys with an hour and a half of hardcore, legitimate evidence that these things happened and existed, producing newspaper reports, documents, police files, anything and everything you could need. And then I just sadly have to tell you at the end of each video or episode, if you're listening, yeah, nothing ever happened. So this whole thing didn't matter. None of this mattered. None of these people were held accountable. No one was ever found for the murder of Gina. Nothing ever came from the CD-ROMs and CDs that contain the names of the who were buying the and the names of the people who were producing it. No one was ever charged for appearing in the videos where they were violently and children from, teenagers to infants that were 18 months old. No one was ever held accountable for any of that stuff, for the nursery that was used as a production studio, for any of these children that were, that anything happened to them. Manuel Shadwell, whose own dad was an intelligence asset. It's just crazy. But that's the end of our story today. That's the end of the report. Yeah, I could go on and talk about this for years, honestly. There's so much information, but I do hope you guys enjoyed this journey with me. Even though it's a dark, twisted, and disturbing journey, it's very important that we learn about these things and share these videos out to people so that people understand that our governments are in on this. They've been in on this, and they will continue to be on this if we don't stop them or raise hell about it. Because look at Epstein. He was just busted in 2019, and this is exactly what he was doing. And P. Diddy as well. Who is the Epstein that's out there right now who has yet to be caught? Who's the next Epstein? That's my question to all of you online. But as always, everybody, I will see you next Wednesday. Keep that tinfoil hat on, stay suspicious, question everything, and I'll see you next time.